My mother hid me from a demon. From beneath a heap of blankets, I listened to the storm pass through. The forest groaned in the wind, hail rattled against the wood plank roof, and my mother huddled against me, telling me a fairy tale that I already knew by heart. Once upon a time, there lived a brave queen and her son, the handsome young prince. They lived in a cabin deep in the woods, because the brave queen had a terrible secret. The young prince's father was secretly a terrible demon. He could fool the rest of the world, but not the brave queen. She knew that while he looked and spoke like a man, he was really a demon in disguise. That's why she escaped from the palace with her young prince, and hid him away someplace where the demon would never, ever find him. What did the demon look like? I always asked, even though I was as terrified as I was fascinated by the answer that was coming. Well, my mother began, her paws filled by a peal of thunder. His skin is as gray and rotten as an old dead tree. He has 6 fingers on each hand, and his nails are as sharp as hawthorn needles. His smile is as wide as a grinning deer's skulls, and when he opens his mouth, it's big enough to swallow a little boy whole. But nobody else can see it. To them, the demon is another person, just like you or me. He's very clever, and it wasn't easy for the brave queen and her handsome prince to get away. The demon hired wicked men to follow them, and the brave queen and her handsome young prince had to give up all the luxuries that they used to have in the palace. Several times, they were nearly caught. When that happened, they had to run away and leave everything behind. It wasn't easy, but the brave queen would have done anything in the world to be with her handsome young prince. The battering wind and rain were so loud that I could barely hear my mother's voice, but it didn't matter. I could feel her warmth. I snuggled against her and fell asleep. I saw the demon for the first time the next morning, or at least I thought I did. My mother and I were collecting mushrooms by the creek when the hair on the back of my neck suddenly stood on end. I was being watched, I could feel it. I looked frantically around for my mother, but she turned her back to me for a moment as she foraged. Normally, she never let me out of her sight. How long had the demon been stalking us, just waiting for an opportunity like this? A twig snapped. I spun around to see a black, vaguely humanoid shape moving toward me through the woods. I ran to my mother, too terrified of the thing behind me to even scream. Grasping immediately that something was wrong, my mother abandoned her mushrooms, scooped me into her arms, and ran for the safety of our cabin. No demon came crashing through our door, but when we returned to the creek a few hours later, the mushrooms and basket were gone. My mother had always carried a pistol in her belt, but after that, she kept it drawn in her hand. As dusk settled on the forest, she burst into the clearing that surrounded our cabin, searching for any sign of the demon. A gunshot reverberated among the endless trees. "Come out, you bastard!" my mother screamed. "You might want him, but you'll never have him." It was then that I heard a second set of footsteps fast approaching the cabin. There was no time to close it or to warn my mother. I pressed myself against the wall and shut my eyes instead. Seconds later, a small square something flew through the cabin window. It was a picture. It showed my mother and I smiling with a man who looked like me. On the back, strange symbols had been scribbled with black ink. I peeked out the empty window into the gloomy woods. Whoever had thrown in through the window was long gone. I found myself staring at the picture for a long time, wondering if it was some kind of evil magic that kept me from tearing my eyes away. I was so lost in those 3 smiling faces that I didn't even notice that my mother was back. She snatched the photo out of my grasp with trembling hands, muttering 2 blood-chilling words. "It's him." Pistol in hand, she started packing right away and jumped at every sound. Once everything we could take had been packed into her ancient, rumbling Chevy truck, she splashed gasoline through every room of the cabin and struck a match. Before we drove away, she threw the photo into the blaze. Fog had rolled in with the cool night air, turning the woods into a sea of white. We hardly ever left the cabin, and the overgrown dirt track that led away from it was difficult to navigate at the best of times. My mother drove white-knuckled, gritting her teeth at each pothole and scraping bush. To me, their thorns sounded like the claws of the demon. With a sudden boom, The steering wheel went slack. My mother braked frantically, and when I saw the whites of her terrified eyes, I knew that we were thinking the same thing. Both tires bursting had been no accident. Something flew out of the fog and crashed into the driver's side window, creating a spiderweb pattern crack. My mother shrieked, covering her face against the glass as something else shattered it. Hands reached through the shattered glass. They pinned my mother's arms to her side as she fired her pistol wildly. In the cramped space, the sound was deafening. I shut my eyes and covered my ears, waiting for the nightmare to be over. Instead, my mother was dragged out the window into the darkness. No matter how tightly I pressed my hands over my ears, I could still hear her screams. They turned to moans and finally to silence. That silence, that waiting, was worse than everything I'd experienced so far. In the end, those unfamiliar hands closed around me, just as I always knew they would. "It's all right, son." A husky, unfamiliar voice sobbed into my neck. "It's over. It's finally over." The case was quite sensational for its time. There were many who questioned the motives and legality of a father who used private detectives and second-hand police chain spikes to recover his son when the law wouldn't do it, even if the mother was a member of a cult. At the time, of course, I was concerned with other things, like all of the big words the men in white coats around me were using. Words like malnutrition, illiterate, and brainwashing. Later there would be other, better words like school, bicycle, games, and friends. My favorite words of all, however, I learned thanks to my father, family, and home. Do not feed the midnight clowns. The sign was an improvised marriage of laminated paper and flimsy wood. The plastic was worn at the edges and the original yellow coloring of the paper had soaked away through untold seasons, but the message of the sign was clear. In bold Comic Sans font, it read, "Do not feed the midnight clowns." The drive from Olomouc to Prague took 3 hours on a good day and 5 if the D1 was being its usual self, but I always made it without any stops. It was on that particular day, near the tail end of a Sunday afternoon ride, that I felt the need to pull over into that particular gas station. I got a Red Bull and a baguette and sat down at the benches by the parking lot. Getting some caffeine in my system and food in the stomach had me feeling better, but I was still feeling just a bit too sleepy to get back behind the wheel. So, to wake myself up, I went for a bit of a walk around the lot. It was a big place, one of those spots where the long haulers with foreign plates sleep. I walked along the massive trucks carrying mysteries until I reached a slope of gravel. At the bottom of the rocks sat a meadow and, embedded in its unkempt grass, the sign read, "Do not feed the midnight clowns." The first time I had stopped at that gas station was purely by chance, but it quickly became tradition. I was making the drive from Prague to Olomouc just about every Friday afternoon, and driving back just about every Sunday. Stopping by the sign became my little ritual to end the week. Once, on my third pilgrimage or so, I even ventured to ask the gas station attendant about the sign. They were not helpful. Or nice for that matter. The internet was of no help either. The message was there week after week, yet no new clues to its origin presented themselves. So, as the months dragged on, I just found myself content with the mystery of the sign, which read, "Do not feed the midnight clowns." I was seeing a girl in Olomouc. At first the obstacle of distance seemed completely absurd, but love works better when people are at arm's reach. I thought she'd eventually move to the bigger city, but she liked it back home and wanted to stay. She worked at a theater and loved the old building in a way that I couldn't comprehend. As we argued more about the theater and our diverting future, we started to see each other less. After a couple missed visits, we texted each other goodbye. Maybe I was just busy with work, or maybe I was too heartbroken to care, but when I stopped going to Olomouc, I stopped thinking about the sign. For 3 weeks I sulked and worked and slept and drank, and then, on a Friday, just as I was getting ready to spend the evening alone, she showed up at my door. A welcome surprise. We had a splendid weekend and parted on good yet vague terms. Through chat boxes across the week all seemed fine. We spoke as if the past month apart had been a collective hallucination. When I showed up at her place on Friday, however, time came crashing down on us. She seemed happy to see me at first, but 5 days had passed and they made all the difference. Things got sad. Last week's visit might have been a mistake, but this one definitely was. We sat down at her favorite pub, each nursed a solitary beer and tried to make sense of the future. When the pauses in conversation got too long to bear, I decided it would be best for me to go back home. I had scarcely sipped from my beer, but it was already dark. There could be plenty of dangers lurking in the darkness of the D1 highway. She insisted I stay, even if only on the couch. I couldn't. There were 2 stops I took on my drive back home. The first, not far out of Olomouc, was at a roadside McDonald's. My nerves kept me from eating the whole day and, as I sat in the parking lot by the Golden Arches, they kept me unhungry still. I took a couple tasteless bites of my burger before I got back on the road. In darkness and silence, I drove back home, resolved to stop at a familiar parking lot with a makeshift sign. No truckers slept that night. The parking lot, much like the gas station, was empty. I didn't mind the solitude though. Parking back in my usual spot after a month-long break brought up plenty of feelings, and on the back of those feelings my hunger returned. I ate my now cold McDonald's with only flashes of headlights from the highway for company. I got through the burger, but by the time I ate my first nugget I was wiping my fingers and checking my phone. She hadn't called and she hadn't written. It was just a couple minutes after midnight. That's when I noticed the bobbing red light on the far side of the parking lot. At first, I thought it just a reflection of the passing cars, yet even when the road was empty the small blimp of red continued to hover in the darkness. For a while I sat still, trying to uncover the mystery of the light from the comfort of my own car. I ate my cold McNuggets and watched, and finally, when only stale fries in a paper bag remained, I got out of the car. The walk to the edge of the parking lot wasn't far, yet the closer I got the more my steps slowed. At first, the bobbing red light was just that, a featureless glow in the darkness. The closer I got, however, the more my steps started to slow. The red light was starting to resemble the nose of a clown. I never took the concept of the midnight clown seriously. I always considered the sign in the meadow to be the result of some inside joke or quirky artistry. Looking at that bobbing red light, however, had me questioning my skepticism. A flash of light from a passing car dispelled all doubt. I saw him for only a second, but the afterburn of the bizarre image lingered in the darkness. The red light was a glowing clown nose attached to a pale face with frizzled hair. In the darkness there was a clown, and he was balancing on stilts. The sight made me doubt my sanity, and I was uncomfortable enough to consider retreating to my car. But just as I was about to turn around and run, I heard the queerest of sounds. I lack the words to fully describe it, but it was like a mixture of whistling and children's laughter, a strange song which lacked all melody or tempo. It was coming, ever so faintly, from the far side of the parking lot. The clown on the stilts had made me beyond uncomfortable, but there was something about that queer song that filled my heart with calm. Perhaps it was out of curiosity, or perhaps it was because the thought of going back home to my empty apartment made me sick. I decided to investigate the strange music. The sign had not changed, yet it no longer seemed absurd. At the bottom of the slope of gravel, all around the lowly meadow, frolicked the midnight clowns. There were about a dozen of them, all of different shapes and sizes, all dancing and twirling and enjoying the night. Their eyes shone with a calm pale blue and their noses, much like the one of the stilt walker, lit up in bright blood red. I stood not far from the clowns in plain sight, yet none of them acknowledged me. Their song, although unconventional in its composition, seemed friendly, and the way they danced and rolled around the meadow didn't make the clowns seem dangerous. But I knew better than to spend my evening with strangers in unlit wilderness. Making as little noise as I could, I retreated back to my car. The absurdity of what I had seen, although seemingly harmless, had become far too much to handle on my own. The moment I got back in my car, almost by instinct, I called her. And I told her about the sign and the clowns, but even in that moment the wild strangers in the meadow seemed less pressing than our relationship. We talked. We talked for a long time and, as we talked, I fished out my stale French fries from the McDonald's bag and picked away at them when the words I wanted to say got stuck in my throat. We talked, and as we talked, my attention drifted from the bobbing red light in the distance. It wasn't until we said our final goodbyes and hung up that I noticed that the sole clown nose was no longer alone. Like bloody fireflies, the crowd of clowns approached my car from the far side of the parking lot. They hopped and danced and did cartwheels in my direction, all while producing the eerie notes of that strange song. They moved quick. By the time I got the motor running, the clowns had surrounded my car. With long, thin fingers they pressed against my windows, and with shining, starving eyes they looked at my half-empty pack of French fries. The midnight clowns were discomforting from the very start, but it wasn't until they had their faces pressed against the windshield of my car that I felt true terror. They had the faces of children. Even though some of them had scraggly beards and most seemed to possess the bodies of full-grown adults, all the clowns had the innocent faces of children. Their teeth, however, exuded a wholly different mood. Like thin writhing tentacles, they moved around their small mouths. The longer the strange creatures looked at my pack of French fries, the more bits of glowing red spittle slid down their childish chins. The midnight clowns watched my food, and with their strange writhing dentures they licked at their thin lips. Before the creatures could fully surround my car, I got in reverse and hightailed as far away from that parking lot as I could. As hungry as the clowns were, and as quickly as they had moved before, they did not make chase. For a couple panicked moments I could see the stilt-walking clown in my rearview mirror, but even he soon disappeared. I got away safely, yet when I was still in that parking lot a strange thought swirled through my mind. I considered, very briefly, feeding the midnight clowns. They did, after all, look very hungry, and there was something about the strange music that escaped their lips that had me feeling charitable about my cold McDonald's. I do not know if the idea to feed the clowns came of my own will, or whether they had somehow forced the thought into my skull through their queer dances and music. Regardless of how the idea of sharing my food grasped my consciousness, however, I rejected it. I rejected it because I remembered the sign. I remembered the makeshift sign in an inconspicuous meadow that provided a single line of advice. I remembered the sign that read, ever so clearly, "Do not feed the midnight clowns." Thanks for watching. Subscribe and stay tuned for another episode tomorrow.